Before the advent of social networks and instant messaging, the world of communication was very different, more alive, real, and filled with a special atmosphere. People genuinely valued every moment of conversation and put their heart into every email. So how did people keep in touch with each other when there were no smartphones and chat rooms? What little rituals and habits created a sense of closeness at a distance? Many meetings started with a simple phone call, and correspondence could last for weeks, but brought joy every time. In this video, we dive into the everyday life of the 1970s, an era when every word and every action in communication had its own unique value. Have you ever wondered how your relationships would change if communication became as slow and meaningful? Now is the time to remember how it really was. Face-to-face meetings. Live face-to-face communication was the most important way to maintain relationships. In the 1970s, face-to-face meetings were the center of all communication. To talk to a friend, you had to make an appointment in advance and come to a certain place, a park, a cafe, or just on the front porch. Meetings lasted for hours. No one was in a hurry. Conversations were deep and real. Voices, gestures, facial expressions. All this made communication lively and rich. Sometimes meeting at someone's house, getting together as a group, sharing news and plans. Walks on the streets or bike rides were often accompanied by conversation and laughter. At parties or dances, new people were met, acquaintances were made, and relationships were built. Face-to-face meetings allowed not only to talk, but also to see reactions and feel the mood of the interlocutor. At these moments, all worries were forgotten, and a feeling of real closeness appeared. In cafes, we sometimes ordered tea or coffee, sat at tables and discussed everything from music to politics. At school breaks, we would gather in a group and exchange impressions about classes or movies. In the evenings, in parks or on benches, yards were filled with lively speech and jokes. Sometimes meetings were held by a river or a lake, where you could sit and think quietly. Lively communication allowed to create unforgettable memories because each meeting was unique. Future plans were discussed, dreams and secrets were shared. Personal meetings were often accompanied by music when someone brought a guitar or a tape recorder. At such moments, it seemed that time stopped and the world narrowed down to a circle of friends. It was a way to feel part of something big and important. Without electronic devices, a meeting required effort and attention, but that's why it was valued so highly. Every word and gesture mattered, making communication deep and sincere. Phone calls. Home landline phones were a popular means of communication, with calls often lasting a long time. The phone hung on the kitchen or living room wall, with a long cord that allowed at least some movement during the call. A phone call was an event. You had to think carefully about what to say before dialing a number, because the call wasn't free and every minute counted. There were no cell phones in those days, and the phone line was often one for the whole family. To call a friend, you had to wait until the phone was free, and sometimes you had to arrange a time to call in advance. Conversations on the phone could last for hours, discussing everything that happened during the day, weekend plans, and news. Hearing the voice of a loved one on the other end of the line was comforting and uplifting. Sometimes, if the call was between cities or states, the conversation was accompanied by the sound of switching lines, which added to the sense of importance of the moment. The telephone was also a means of urgent communication if someone was running late or a message needed to be sent urgently. Much attention was paid to the manner of conversation. The voice had to be polite and calm. Sometimes several people gathered around the phone at once to listen to news from a friend. Dialing a number required a certain skill. A disc phone made you rotate a ring of numbers, and if you made a mistake, you had to start again. Telephone conversations were an important part of social life. They replaced face-to-face meetings, especially when distances were great. In the moments of waiting for a call, the heart began to beat faster, and hearing a familiar voice became a small celebration. Telephone conversations made it possible to maintain friendships and romantic relationships at a distance. Despite technical limitations, people found ways to make communication lively and warm. Sometimes phone conversations became the occasion for family arguments. Who talks longer or who holds the receiver? The telephone was a real window to the world, connecting family and friends. It was also entertainment. They often turned on music and listened to it together, discussing favorite songs. The importance of phone calls can hardly be overestimated. They were a real bridge between people. Letters and postcards. Writing letters to friends and relatives on paper was a common practice. Letters were written carefully, choosing every word because the envelope had a price on it, and no blank lines were sent unnecessarily. Postcards were often bought in stores with bright pictures and short, warm wishes. Letters shared details of life, events, joys, and sorrows. Many carefully decorated the letters with small drawings or stickers to make them more personal. The wait for a reply was long, sometimes weeks, but it made the correspondence special and valuable. Letters conveyed not only words but also emotions, which were felt through the handwriting and writing style. For many, it was a kind of meditation, a moment of silence and concentration. Letters could express what was difficult to say in person: fears, hopes, confessions. Sometimes the whole family gathered to write a letter, especially if someone was serving in the army far from home. Often letters were sent in a chain, from one acquaintance to another if the addressees changed. In schools and universities, correspondence was part of the learning process and social life. Letters were kept as treasures, reread in times of need. Delivery times were unpredictable. Mail could be delayed by weather or holidays. Postage stamps became collector's items, sometimes specially chosen to be beautiful or themed. With the advent of new technology, writing letters remained an important means of expressing feelings and support. Letters were often written on special letterheads with logos or patterns. Sometimes small photographs or newspaper clippings were included in the letters. Letters helped keep families separated by distance connected. A letter was more personal than a phone call and was seen as a sign of attention and care. Correspondence formed a special relationship. It created real closeness at a distance. Newspapers and magazines, reading ads and letters in the letters to the editor sections kept people informed. Many people started each morning by looking at the latest newspaper. Not only the news, but also the sections with readers' letters and advertisements. In these letters, you could sometimes find lively discussions of important topics, reviews of articles, and even arguments between readers. Newspaper advertisements were a real window into the life of the city. They were used to look for jobs, offer services, or invite people to meetings. Magazines published columns with advice and life stories. People learned about new trends and ideas. Newspapers and magazines delivered not only information, but also a sense of community. Readers felt part of a larger conversation. The letters to the editor section sometimes became a platform for expressing opinions that were not always reflected in official articles. In small towns, newspapers played the role of a link between residents, helping to maintain social ties. Announcements of cultural events, concerts, plays, exhibitions, often attracted attention and became an occasion for meetings. During election campaigns, newspapers were an important source of information about candidates and voters' opinions. Readers looked for answers to their questions and solutions to everyday problems in newspapers. Sometimes readers' letters included stories of personal experiences, which made reading particularly moving and lively. Newspapers and magazines were accessible and understandable. They were used by all generations. Many letters came to the editorial offices, some of which were published to show different points of view. Such letters created a sense of dialogue between society and journalists. Sometimes the newspapers published notices about missing people or animals, important for the local community. Newspapers kept the town and village connected by reporting news from neighboring areas. For many, reading newspapers was part of the morning ritual, a cup of coffee and the latest news. Ads helped organize joint projects, from craft fairs to school events. Newspapers and magazines became an archive of time, preserving the memory of how people lived and thought decades ago. Notebooks and diaries are personal records and correspondence on paper. Diaries were the repository of the most intimate thoughts and experiences, where you wrote down everything you wanted to keep only for yourself. They recorded the events of the day, moods, plans, and dreams. These pages became a personal space where there was no need to hide feelings. Notebooks were often carried around with them to record an important thought or interesting observation at any time. Correspondence in notebooks could be carried on by several people. passing the notebook to each other, leaving notes and comments. Diary pages were sometimes decorated with drawings, newspaper clippings, or small souvenirs. Keeping a diary helped to reflect on what was happening and find answers to inner questions. Many diaries were written in neat handwriting, using colored pens and pencils to highlight important passages. Sometimes diaries turned into real, creative projects with stories, poems, and notes about books read. By keeping a diary, a person learned to understand himself and the world around him. It was a way of preserving moments that quickly faded from memory. By corresponding on paper, friends could exchange notes in notebooks that became a symbol of their friendship. Sometimes diaries became family heirlooms, passed down from generation to generation. They preserved the unique atmosphere of a time and mood that could not be brought back. Diary entries helped to better prepare for important events, reflected inner growth and change. Keeping a diary was not only useful, but also a kind of therapy, a way to cope with anxiety and stress. Unlike talking, the entries stayed forever, helping to revisit the past and understand oneself. Notebooks were often made of plain paper, but for their owners, they became a real treasure. Writing by hand meant putting a part of one's soul into the words. Sometimes the diaries became a source of inspiration for creativity or new ideas. Each page was a step in the journey of one's life. Radio announcements. Sometimes messages or invitations to meetings were broadcast over the radio. Radio was one of the main sources of information and entertainment, and it was there that important announcements could be heard. Evening broadcasts often included calls for meetings, invitations to concerts or sporting events. Radio announcements carried news of missing persons, job calls, or volunteer activities. Sometimes radio stations held promotions with prize drawings, and listeners could hear their names on the air. Radio announcements were available to anyone with a simple radio receiver, in the house, in the car, or on the street. Some announcements were so detailed that you could find out the exact time and place of an appointment. Often radio stations would play music and talk about local events at the same time, bringing listeners together. People got used to waiting for a certain time so they wouldn't miss the right announcement. Radio announcements were used to coordinate volunteer movements, school events, and even community service. In those days, radio had a special magic. The announcer's voice created a sense of personal communication. Messages were transmitted quickly and reached a large audience, which was important in small towns and rural areas. Many people found out about new jobs or urgent events through the radio. Radio announcements helped organize reunions of friends and relatives, especially when no one had a telephone. Sometimes listeners wrote down important information from the announcement on paper so they wouldn't forget. Radio created a lively sense of community, thousands of people listening to a single message at the same time. Announcements were often accompanied by comments or advice from the presenters. Holiday greetings or congratulatory messages were transmitted through the radio. It was a convenient way to quickly deliver news to a wide audience. Radio announcements created a special atmosphere of expectation and hope where everyone could feel heard. In a context of limited communications, radio became a real link between people. Meetings in public places, parks, cafes, libraries were popular gathering points for socializing. A couple of benches in parks turned into real centers of attraction. Friends met there, discussed news, and just spent time. Cafes with loud music and the smell of fresh coffee became places for long conversations and new acquaintances. Libraries were not only a repository of books, but also a place for quiet meetings and discussions, where you could read together and share your thoughts. On park benches, companies often gathered, exchanged the latest gossip, and planned outings together. In cafes at tables, people discussed not only news, but also music, movies, sports, everything that was important in life. Libraries hosted theme nights, lectures, or movie screenings that attracted lovers of culture and knowledge. Public places were a convenient meeting ground when it was necessary to agree face-to-face. Parks hosted picnics and family gatherings where neighbors could get to know each other. Cafes sometimes became places for first dates and romantic conversations. In the library, you could often find school children studying for exams and students discussing projects. Flyers announcing upcoming events were often handed out in these places. Meetings in parks and cafes created the feeling of a lively city, full of movement and socialization. Sometimes musicians would gather on benches and their tunes would bring listeners together. These places were not just dots on the map, but real centers of community life. In the evenings, the parks were filled with the light of lanterns and conversation, which made the atmosphere cozy and warm. Cafes were especially popular with young people, where music and conversation lasted late into the night. Libraries maintained an atmosphere of respect and tranquility, bringing people together in the pursuit of knowledge. In such places, strong friendships were formed and new stories began. Meeting in public places was a natural part of everyday life, without hurry or fuss. School bulletin boards. School bulletin boards were where announcements of events and meetings were hung. The school bulletin board was the main center of information for students and teachers. Exam schedules, schedules of clubs and sports practices were posted there. Invitations to school dances and discos, the most awaited events for high school students, were also posted there. The announcements announced extracurricular activities, excursions, and charity events. Each new announcement aroused keen interest. It was an occasion for conversations and plans. Lost and found announcements hung on the board, helping to quickly recover lost items. Sometimes information about college and university admissions was posted, helping to prepare for the future. Classrooms sometimes made collective announcements that teachers were asked to write in their journals. The blackboard was the place where students learned about contests and competitions. Parents also paid attention to school announcements to keep up to date with their children's lives. Schools often organized fairs and exhibitions, which were announced through bulletin boards. Rules of behavior and important safety news were posted there. The announcements were updated regularly to keep the information up to date. For many students, the bulletin board was a place to meet and exchange news. Invitations to concerts and productions appeared on the bulletin board during the holiday season. Students read the announcements during recess, discussing upcoming events. Often the announcements were accompanied by colorful drawings and decorations. The board was a reflection of school life. It was a place of activity and discussion of important topics. Through the announcements, school culture and a sense of belonging were formed. Many people remember how eagerly they waited for new entries on this wall. Hobby clubs are book clubs, sports clubs, and other gatherings based on hobbies. Clubs brought together people with similar interests and created a special community where passion and knowledge could be shared. Book clubs discussed new publications, shared impressions of books they had read, and recommended authors to each other. Sports clubs brought together fans of soccer, baseball, or tennis, where they not only practiced but also built strong friendships. Such clubs organized regular meetings, trainings, and competitions, which became an important part of life. Hobby clubs often organized joint trips to competitions or cultural events. Music clubs brought together rock and jazz music lovers to discuss concerts and new albums. Handicraft or painting clubs taught new techniques and exchanged tips. Often clubs were connected with local libraries or cultural centers that provided meeting spaces. Long friendships and even romantic relationships were formed in the clubs. Many people found support and understanding in the clubs, which was especially important for teenagers. Discussions ranged from serious conversations to joking comments. The clubs helped develop communication and organization skills. Participants could participate in competitions and festivals, presenting their achievements. Club meetings became a regular event to look forward to. Clubs created a sense of belonging to something more than just a hobby. In these communities, people learned to work in teams and express themselves. Clubs were often a place to find a mentor or just a buddy. Time spent in a club left vivid memories and valuable experiences. Clubs were the living embodiment of the human desire to socialize and develop. Public events were concerts, fairs, and dances where people met and socialized. Public events brought all kinds of people together, creating a space to meet and get to know each other. Concerts were not only an occasion to listen to music, but also a place to meet friends and share experiences. Fairs offered not only goods, but also entertainment. Games, amusement rides, street performances. Dances were organized in halls and in the open air, where young people and adults gathered to relax and socialize. On such evenings, laughter, music, and lively conversations were heard. The atmosphere was full of energy and joy. Public events became a tradition for many families and friends, bringing generations together. Fairs and festivals often featured contests where you could win prizes and meet new people. Concerts often drew large crowds where socializing took place, not only on stage but also in the crowd of listeners. Dance evenings were where new romances were born and friendships were forged. Fairs combined both trade and cultural events, creating a unique holiday atmosphere. People came to these events to get away from their daily routines and to feel part of a community. Public events were often accompanied by street food and craft workshops. Evenings with live music and dancing became an important social event. Public events helped to preserve traditions and develop local culture. At these meetings, news was exchanged and future events were planned together. People came with their families, friends, or even alone to find new acquaintances. The atmosphere was filled with goodwill and mutual support. The public events created a sense of celebration in ordinary days. Moments of joy were recalled and became part of the common memory. These meetings strengthened the sense of community and kept the social interaction alive. Fax, rare. Some organizations use fax machines to transmit documents. Faxes were rare in the 1970s, and not all offices or institutions had them. It was mainly used for urgent documents that needed to be sent quickly to another city or state. The machine took up a lot of space and did not work very fast. Noise and crackling were an integral part of the process. Sometimes you had to wait several minutes at a time for the page to fully run and appear on the other end. Fax transmission was expensive, so it was used only in exceptional cases, for example, for important contracts or emergency orders. Despite the technological novelty, the image quality was poor. Lines were sometimes smeared, and you had to call to clarify details. Fax was perceived as a means of business communication, and ordinary people hardly used it. Sometimes office workers sat next to the machine, waiting for confirmation of transmission. The sound of the fax machine was firmly associated with seriousness and formality. For many, it was an impressive experience to see paper with text travel down a wire to another device. In some cases, documents had to be faxed multiple times due to poor connections. As time went on, faxes became a little more affordable, but in the 70s remained more of an exception. The advent of the fax signaled the beginning of a new era in communications. But back then, it still seemed very technical and distant. Every time it was possible to fax something, it was seen as a big plus. Fax was seen as a reliable way to transmit important documents without the risk of losing the letter. Internal office messages were also sometimes faxed to speed things up. It was not always possible to set up the machine correctly the first time, which added to the nervousness. For many companies, faxing became a means of competition. Whoever sent it fastest won the case. Data transmission via fax was perceived as a small miracle of long-distance communication. Talking machines, message machines. Sometimes you could leave a note on special devices. Talking machines were rare and were found in large cities or at train stations. They were special devices where you could insert a tape with a recorded voice message or leave a note. Sometimes vending machines allowed you to send a short voice message to your loved ones or business associates. They seemed very handy in situations where you couldn't talk in person or leave a letter. Sometimes at train stations, these machines were used to send urgent messages to those who were late for a train. By inserting a coin, the recorded message became available for the recipient to listen to. In some cases, the machines functioned as telephone booths with a recording function. People recorded important messages so they could get a reply if they couldn't get through. Such machines created a sense of novelty and technological advancement. Voice messages felt like a living presence, even if the person couldn't answer right away. Sometimes short greetings or invitations to meetings were left. Automated machines could be placed in offices, on the streets, and by subway stations. There weren't many of them, and many people didn't know they existed. Using talking machines required skill. You had to write down the message quickly and clearly. They helped reduce the time waiting for a response and allowed you to convey emotion with your voice. These devices were the forerunners of modern voice messaging in telephones. People experimented with the machines by recording joking or warm addresses. Despite the limited recording time, the messages often became memorable and were stored on cassettes. Sometimes the noise in the street made it difficult to record a good message. Message machines added a new dimension to communication, making it more lively and human. Telegraph. For urgent communications on rare occasions, The telegraph remained an important means of urgent communication in the 1970s, although not for everyday communication. It was used mainly for business and official communications, where it was important to transmit information quickly over long distances. Telegraph messages consisted of short, clear phrases, sometimes seeming a bit dry due to character limitations. It was more expensive to send a telegram than to write a letter, so this method was chosen only when absolutely necessary. Telegraph offices often employed skilled operators who translated text into special codes and back again. The message could contain greetings, news of incidents, business notices, and invitations. Sometimes telegrams arrived at night, breaking the silence and causing excitement. The text of a telegram had to be carefully thought out so as not to waste unnecessary words. Every character was paid for. The sender would write the text in advance, and the operator would pass it on to the recipient, where it would be printed out or written down by hand. The telegraph was especially important for those who did not have regular telephone service. Sometimes telegrams were transmitted via radio, which made it possible to reach remote areas. Many people memorized the first words of a telegram, which could change the course of events. Telegraph messages were often associated with urgency and the importance of information. In some cases, telegrams were delivered by couriers rushing with important news. The telegraph was a means of connecting distant parts of the country and even the world. Over time, the frequency of telegraph use declined, giving way to other forms of communication. Nevertheless, in the 70s, it remained a sought-after tool for urgent business and personal messages. The telegraph allowed you to bypass the constraints of time and distance, giving you the hope of receiving important news soon. In those years, it was a symbol of official and urgent communication. Telegraph messages were sometimes the beginning of important changes and events. Ads on stands and in storefronts. Local announcements about goods and services, appointments. Booth ads in stores and public places were the main information gathering point for many residents of towns and neighborhoods. They hung prominently, neatly attached or nailed down, attracting the keen interest of passers-by. These boards offered everything from job offers to advertisements for local services, bicycle sales, and party invitations. Sometimes the ads were handwritten, using brightly colored markers or pencils to attract attention. Storefronts became mini information centers where people could find out about upcoming fairs or music events. People checked these stands regularly to make sure they didn't miss important news or bargains. The announcements often included phone numbers or addresses for contact. Sometimes bus schedules or schedules of local institutions were posted there. The posters served as a link between neighborhood residents and businesses. Many people used them to find traveling companions or exchange goods. You could also find information about school events or hobby clubs. Announcements changed frequently. Some disappeared, others appeared, creating a lively and constantly updated picture of life in the neighborhood. They helped people find what they needed quickly and without too much hassle. Storeboards were convenient because the information was available to everyone, even those who did not use the telephone. Sometimes messages about missing pets or lost items were left on these boards. Announcements helped build a local community by bringing people together by interests and needs. They could be used to arrange meetings, make arrangements for buying or exchanging things. Some ads were decorated with drawings or funny inscriptions, making the information more lively. These boards often became a point of communication for neighbors and friends. In cities and small towns, these notices were a true window into the life of the neighborhood. Friends through friends, passing news and messages orally through a chain of acquaintances. News and important messages were often transmitted orally, through friends, neighbors, and acquaintances. Such a chain conveyed not only information, but also moods and emotions, making the story lively and colorful. The message could change several times, adding new details or simplifying for easy memorization. Sometimes it was through such intermediaries that one learned the latest news from afar. This network of acquaintances and friends was important to keep in touch, especially when there were no other means of communication. The transmission of news took place during meetings on the street, in stores, or at parties. News spread quickly, sometimes instantly, and sometimes took center stage in conversations. Many relied on this oral network, trusting information received through acquaintances. Sometimes rumors turned into amusing stories that were shared within the company. Passing information in this way created a sense of closeness and mutual support. It was important to convey the message accurately, but sometimes emotions took over and the stories became more expressive. Such chains could also spread invitations to meetings, festivals, gatherings. Through friends, it was possible to learn about new people or events earlier than through official channels. Sometimes news was spread in several ways at the same time, reinforcing its importance. This way of communication was natural and did not require any technical means. In a friendly company, they often discussed and clarified what they heard, creating a general picture of what was happening. Oral communication was alive, filled with intonation and feelings. Communicating news in this way brought people together, creating strong social ties. It was not just an exchange of information, but a part of everyday life, where every word had weight. In those days, it was through friends that the main conversations and understanding of what was going on took place. Carrier pigeons, as a joke or in certain places, are an almost rare method, but are sometimes mentioned as a curio. Post pigeons were seen more as an amusing curio, but in some small communities or farms, they were actually used to send short messages. The pigeons were real heroes. They were trained to return home, and because of this, it was possible to send important news if no other means of communication was available. The message was carefully wrapped up in a tiny bundle and attached to the pigeon's leg. The pigeons flew over fields and roads, avoiding obstacles and reaching the addressee. Sometimes they became a kind of symbol of hope and patience, for it could take hours to reach the recipient. Although it seemed almost fantastical, on rare occasions, pigeons helped to convey urgent news, especially where there was no telephone service. Many viewed carrier pigeons with a dose of romance and nostalgia, envisioning them as living carriers of secret messages. The knowledge that a pigeon could return home even after tens of kilometers was admired. Sometimes, however, pigeons got lost, flew in the wrong direction, or simply did not return. It happened that pigeons got into trouble because of predators or bad weather, and this added to the excitement. It was sometimes jokingly said that carrier pigeons were the oldest messenger no one argued with. Although actual use was limited, stories about pigeons were passed around as amusing tales. They were used at festivals or celebrations to create a special atmosphere. The carrier pigeons were a reminder of a time when every message was an event. In some regions, pigeons were still kept to communicate between houses or farms. Sometimes schools held lessons about pigeon mail, telling the history of this method. Pigeons became a symbol of peace and communication in the hearts of many. Despite technological advances, the idea of pigeon mail retained its charm and inspired imagination. For many, it was not just a joke, but a living reminder of a slower and more awe-inspiring time. Handwritten notes, at school or at work, exchanging notes on pieces of paper. Handwritten notes were an everyday part of communication at school and at work. Papers with short messages were hidden in notebooks, passed from hand to hand quietly so no one would notice. In school classrooms, it was a way to exchange news, confessions, or even small secrets. The notes were written in different handwriting, some neatly, some hastily, leaving only a few words or a drawing. Sometimes a piece of paper could be the beginning of a whole chain of messages between several friends. They were quickly read, whispered about, and then hidden or defaced so that no one would recognize the contents. At work, notes helped convey a request or message if the phone was busy or inconvenient. In some cases, notes were a way of expressing feelings that one did not dare to say out loud. They were often decorated with drawings or hearts to add a special charm. Sometimes notes were hidden in pockets or under books to keep a secret. Sometimes it was necessary to invent special ways of transmission through classmates or colleagues who were closer to the addressee. The exchange of notes created an atmosphere of lively, personal communication. Everyone tried to write something funny or touching to bring a smile. Sometimes the notes became the cause of small conflicts if they went to the wrong place. At school or in the office, it was one way to keep in touch without technical means. Notes added variety to an ordinary day by making you wait for the moment to receive and read them. They were written on whatever was handy: notebook pages, scraps of paper, napkins. Handwritten notes created an atmosphere of mystery and play that made communication special. Many people kept their most memorable notes in school scrapbooks or personal drawers. This way of communication was lively, emotional, and always unexpected. Roll call and shouting in the street. Acquaintances shouted to each other from a distance to quickly convey simple messages. Roll call and shouting in the street were part of everyday life, especially in small neighborhoods and districts. People recognized the voices of neighbors from afar and could call out to them simply by shouting to convey urgent or important news. Sometimes names were shouted, inviting help or giving a warning about something. It was a quick and direct way to get in touch when the telephone was unavailable. Street roll calls were accompanied by gestures, waving hands, nodding, that helped to better understand the meaning. Sometimes neighbors shouted to each other to arrange a meeting or to share happy news. In small towns and villages, such shouting was the norm, and it created a sense of close community. Sometimes the shouts turned into amusing dialogues accompanied by laughter. The roll call could be a warning of a thunderstorm, fire, or other important events. The voices of the familiar echoed through the streets, filling the space with life and movement. Roll call helped to keep in touch and stay in touch with neighbors without any technical means. Hands-free announcements in public spaces such as train stations or markets. Hands-free announcements were an important part of life in train stations, markets, and large public spaces. The voice of an announcer or staff member would be heard over the loudspeaker, relaying train timetables, reports of lost items, or announcements of events. These announcements helped keep everyone informed of important events, especially when there were many people around. Sometimes announcements were accompanied by beeps or music to attract attention. In markets, a voice over a loudspeaker invited shoppers to discounts or special offers. Loudspeaker announcements could be played several times so that no one missed the information. Stations used them to announce train arrivals and departures, as well as safety warnings. Sometimes the voice was so loud that it could be heard in the street, creating a special atmosphere for the city. Announcements over the loudspeaker could bring a smile if the announcer added humorous comments or music. People became accustomed to responding to these sounds, associating them with certain events or times of the day. In rural areas, loudspeakers were used to broadcast news or invitations to local meetings. Sometimes announcements were accompanied by signs or visual cues. Loudspeakers created an effect of presence and brought disparate people together in one space. Sometimes the voice-over speakerphone became a familiar and even a favorite element of city life. Thanks to these announcements, people knew when something important was happening and could react in a timely manner. Announcements created a sense of order and organization in crowded places. For many people, the loudspeaker was a link to the world around them. Television shows and programs are shows with interactive segments where viewers could call in or write letters. Television shows in the 1970s often included interactive segments, allowing viewers to actively participate in the life of the program. Calls to the studio were a popular way to ask questions, voice an opinion, or win a prize. Sometimes the programs read letters from viewers, creating a sense of personal interaction with the hosts. Many people waited for their favorite programs to air to hear answers to their questions or to hear commentary on events. Television shows with an interactive format became a real event in the life of a family. The studios sometimes invited guests from the audience or viewers, which added liveliness and energy. Letters and calls could be about a variety of topics, from cooking to politics. Sometimes the host would read out greetings or messages sent from around the country. Television programs became not only an entertaining, but also an educational channel of communication. Some programs had quizzes where viewers could call in and win gifts. Live calls required viewers to be bold and articulate. Letters were often written with great care, framed beautifully to get on the air. Television was becoming the center of communication and information exchange in the family and community. Viewers connected with each other through programs, discussing what they saw and heard. Interactive programs created an effect of participation and involvement. Television programs were often the occasion for live meetings and conversations. These shows conveyed not only information, but also the mood of the era. Television formed a cultural context and brought people together around common interests. Many people kept letters and call recordings as memorable moments of their communication. This way of communication was innovative and inspired further development of communications. In those years, communication was a real ritual. Every letter, every call, every meeting carried a special warmth and sincerity. The world was slower, but it was no less intense. The smell of fresh paper, the sound of the phone ringing on the wall, the familiar noise of the street, all this was created around live human communication. In the hustle and bustle of everyday life, it was moments like these that became the precious threads that connected people to each other. Today, looking back, you can feel the atmosphere of closeness and real contact, which is so difficult to reproduce in the era of digital technology. If you are interested in diving into such stories and learning more about the life of past decades, subscribe to the channel. Together, we will keep the warmth of real communication.